Okay, thank you. Anyways, it's a pleasure to talk to your group. I was hoping to be in Santa Cruz because many of you may know I graduated from Santa Cruz in 1981. So it's always good for me to go back. And when I go back, I always think about what was I like back then? What was I thinking about? And that's part of what I've mandated myself a little bit, is to give my talk a bit of an autobiographical um, theme to it, but to connect together a number of the issues that you'll be interested in policies and marine issues of marine biology, marine conservation, etc. So that's what I'll try and do in this talk. I believe I need to hit the share screen, right?
Yes.
Oh, well, I get host disabled share screen.
Oh, let me
So I have a PowerPoint open right now.
see. Can you try one more time? I just switched one thing.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Good. Okay, so that's somewhere in the middle of my talk. Right, that's not what I wanted. Okay. So there's my talk. Okay. Anyways, the theme democratizing fisheries is really just a very broad title to allow me to say various things. And every time I give a talk with this title, it ends up being slightly different. But it's just this overall theme of the concept of trying to get more engagement in fisheries decisions. Many of you know that fisheries are common pool resources, and so some of the solutions to common pool problems are participation and some, in many cases, democratization of the fishery.
I will see you in a bit.
Hello? Maybe I suggest you mute because I'm hearing people talking when I'm talking. Anyway, best to push the mute button. Anyway, so democratizing fisheries is just a theme to draw together a variety of things, and it and in many cases, for me, it's this interest in the interface between people and governance and culture and population biology. So in many cases, I'll be mixing those things, talking about how those things, I've tried to integrate those things over the course of my career. And so I call it democratizing fisheries while searching for growth and endpoint variables. What I mean there is I'm referring to population biology, that is growth rates, what is often known as R in population biology, and endpoints, which is often known as K. These two are core sort of variables in population biology, and they are related in many ways to production, and production is related, fisheries production, and production is related to many of the kinds of decisions you have to make in fisheries. So, and those decisions are, again, controlled by democratic processes or top-down process, bottom-up processes, depends on how the particular society functions. And so integrating those things is interesting, and one of the challenges that we have in conservation or fisheries management. I put this picture up here because I find it humorous. And you won't find it humorous, but I'll find it humorous because when I think back to my days at UC Santa Cruz, I remember thinking, I used to tell people I was apolitical. I would say, I'm not interested in politics. I'm interested in nature. I saw myself as sort of a nature boy. That's why I went to Santa Cruz. I love the beautiful environment there, the trees, the redwoods, the surfing, et cetera, the search for the truth at the university, engaging in hard truths like evolution and other issues like that. And so when I was probably the age many of you were, I would say, no, I'm apolitical. But maybe that was just to provoke people. And I'm not sure I even knew what I was saying back when I was saying those things, because I was certainly interested in social justice. I was interested in environmental justice, and I was interested in public service. But I often saw politics as being something different from those things, something more nefarious, more subjective, maybe less searching for the truth. and all those things seemed foreign to me at that time. But I did go to Merrill College at Santa Cruz, and that was the third world college, and it was the political college. A lot of my colleagues there were studying political science. I never took a political science course, and maybe I regret that now. But I enjoyed interacting with that group of people because they had pretty broad views. Many of them had been lived in different countries. Many of them spoke foreign languages, and I thought that was very interesting. So I entered into the multicultural dorm. I don't know if they still have it there, but I was one of the few people in a dorm that was multicultural. So the reason this picture is funny to me is this is a forum that I started about 25 years ago to get more engagement in the democratization of fisheries. I started a group which we call the Fishers Forum, and that Fishers Forum was an attempt to reconcile many of the conflicts that were occurring in fisheries. So that became a political process, essentially. For me, it was a way of sharing information and debating issues, but it ultimately ended up in being political in the sense that it was trying to promote change in fisheries. So if you notice, that's me in the middle with the blue shirt on. And there's somewhere in that picture is probably Maxwell, unless he was taking the camera. I can't see him. But anyways, this picture humors me because of what I was saying, that I didn't think I'd be involved in politics, maybe policy in many ways. But then the other day I was thinking back and thinking, I really wonder how true that is. And then I remembered being in Santa Cruz in 1977 and being part of this protest to protest apartheid in South Africa and the investments in the university. And I was one of those people that seized the the administration building, which is near the library, I think. And we were about 800 or 900 students that decided that the university had to stop investing in apartheid, and we were going to take over the university until it did. And I was one of those people. I was not one of the arrested people, the 401 people that were arrested. So it shows how political I was, a certain amount, but not too much. There were about 800 or 900 people that took over the administration. Half of us left, and I was one of those that left. And it was, I joined that demonstration with an African-American friend of mine named John Reed. I think he still lives in Santa Cruz. And about the time the police showed up, he came up to me and said, it's fine for you white boys to get arrested, but for me, it could affect the rest of my life. I'm leaving. And I decided he was probably pretty smart and I should leave as well. So I'm not one of the people that did that. But it made me think, how apolitical was I if I was willing to take over the campus? I must have had some sense of being engaged in politics, at least in social justice. And in many cases, that concern with social justice and environmental justice is in fact what drives a lot of the things that I do. And so in many ways, I've become more political over time because I want to make change, and that requires engaging in politics. Switching subjects again, is about that time that I started engaging in the coral reef fisheries world. There was a few things that I knew about fisheries. I knew some basic population biology, some basic community ecology. I'd been exposed to people like SCs who'd worked on trophic cascades with sea otters and sea urchins. I knew about R and K selection and population biology. And when I entered into the coral reef literature, one of the things I learned fairly early was that people really didn't know what a maximum sustained yield was for a coral reef. And that's amazing. We have millions of people relying on these reefs, and yet we don't really know what the maximum sustained yields are. We knew what yields were, and you can see here they're highly variable, but we didn't really have models of yields. And so that seemed like if you're going to solve this problem of sustainability in coral reefs, you had better know how to calculate maximum sustained yields and find evidence for it, and find ways to make better estimates. And during that time, because the science at that time was fairly basic, people were using equilibrium models, and I won't go into that in any detail, but just remember that that's a fairly simplistic approach to solving this problem. And they had come up with maximum sustained yield levels of like 10 to 16 tons. And if you look at that table, you realize almost none of those yields were reaching that 10 to 16 tons per kilometer squared per year. So it gave one the feeling that, well, there's plenty of time and space and opportunity for people to exploit fisheries more, because this 10 to 16 tons is not being reached in many places in the world. And so that was sort of the state of knowledge at that time. And what I'll show you in the course of this talk is that most of that was quite wrong, and overly optimistic about what the yield levels are. And possibly part of the problems that we're having now are because some of those estimates were very poor estimates. So at that time, when I got engaged in coral reef, I made it one of my interests to figure out what were the recovery rates of fish biomass, which is an important part of determining what yields are like. What are the levels at which biomass would level at? And that's another important variable. That would be K, or B sub naught in fisheries terminology. And then the recovery rate, which would be R. So getting those numbers turned out to be not an easy prospect, not that simple to do. And we, in many cases now looking back, we have much better numbers. I've been a core part of getting better numbers for those things. But it was a very long haul to move from this somewhat quick and dirty way of estimating maximum sustained yield to where we are today, and almost very recently, in the very recent past. Another thing I encountered when I got engaged in fisheries, which was kind of interesting to me, was the idea of blame. That is, in many cases in environmental science, we often go into prejudices about who's to blame for a particular problem, and that focuses our work in terms of identifying and possibly finding blame for these things. And then once we find the blame, then perhaps we get engaged. If we're apolitical, we wouldn't get engaged. We would identify the culprits and then maybe back out and hope the government would take over. And that's a typical way that the university works. It examines a problem, and then it maybe finds the problem. It might find out who or what is to blame, and then walk away from it. And that is not sufficient in conservation or in management if you're engaged in these problems. And in many cases, in many of these countries where maybe the national government or other forms of government are not that engaged, you may not be able to solve those problems just by simply identifying blame and walking away from it. So one thing that I heard many times when I was doing this work and saying, well, there's an overfishing problem in this country, and we need to do something about it. That would be my concern. A lot of times I was told you might have to talk to fishermen. And I always found that odd. What were they implying by have to talk to fishermen? Well, there was this idea that if there was somebody to blame, you might have to engage with those people and talk to them. Well, I didn't have any problem with that idea, yet I know that a lot of people thought, well, you're sort of above the fray. So if you really want to solve this problem, you're going to have to, enter into this engagement, which was not a problem for me, but I noticed that people thought it would be a problem. Maybe it was a language barrier. Maybe it was not speaking Swahili. Maybe it was a cultural barrier. Many of the people there are Muslims or have other cultural issues from me, and therefore maybe I wouldn't be able to engage. Maybe that was the implicit sort of meaning of those kind of things that I heard. But in my own personal view, engaging with fishermen seemed like a good idea to me. And in fact, I've spent the last 30 years doing that. And so much of what I'll talk about is some of the outcomes of that interest in engaging. But that means you have to engage, and the blame game is not not a solution to the problem. Identifying who the problem is or what the problem is not a solution, and it's often highly biased by the way we view problems, and that's something you have to remember. And this is just a very recent graph. This has not been published yet, but it'll give you an idea of why I felt that you had to get involved in governance. These are 16 fish landing sites in East Africa. I think there's one from Madagascar here. Most of these are Kenya and Tanzania. But we ask people to scale their governance. And then we ask them to scale their preferences for restrictions, because one of the core problems of fisheries is finding restrictions that people are willing to comply with, participate in. There are many kinds of restrictions you can have, but if people don't comply or don't participate, they're not very useful. So recently we were able to combine 16 landing sites where there was a government's estimate, and I'll talk more about that, what that is later, and then a restriction preference. And what we found that is the stronger the governance was, the more people were willing to prefer restrictions. So it's not like people don't like restrictions. They have to know that the governance is there to be able to engage in restrictions, to comply with restrictions. So if you want restrictions, which you must have to get sustainability in most systems, then you have to have governance, and governance that works. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but you can see it's quite a strong relationship. And the few things that fall off the line, we know why that is if you study them in detail. However, what I will talk about today is a little bit about getting back to this point of governance versus restrictions. There's a couple of themes that always repeat themselves in democracy and in common pool resource management, and those I would call humorously the tyranny of the majority and the tyranny of the minority. You can have both types of tyranny. In the tyranny of the majority, the democracy is used to undermine the human rights of a minority. And this problem is a recurring theme. So it's common in immature democracies for people to not consider human rights. And in many cases, for me, human rights extend beyond humans and into the environment. So it's possible for a majority of people to get together and make decisions that are very detrimental to the environment. If you can imagine your lamb here as the environment, democracy doesn't often work for you. So democracy is by itself is not a solution to environmental problems, because it's not useful if it for protecting rights unless people acknowledge human rights, rights of the minority, rights of the unspoken, and in many cases that is the environment. The environment has no voice. Its only voice is through people like me and you and other people that think it's important and believe that the environment has a right to exist, that species have a right to exist. And that fundamental issue is a core part of a liberal democracy, the idea of human rights. In many, what I was saying, immature democracies, they think whatever the majority wants is in fact sufficient. But mature democracies acknowledge this human right aspects. And then I think in the modern translation of that for many of us is it extends beyond humans and into more types of things. How far it extends will depend on the circle of your morality, the circle of your ethics. And that is something we can all think about. On the other extreme, there's the tyranny of the minority. I think most of us are more aware of that. And that's the idea that a small, well-organized minority can assert its own interests over the majority. And we see that happening all the time. That's the cases where the wealthy act in the interests of the wealthy and do what's in their own interest. So both of those ideas are common themes, and you have to think about what's going on in the system that you're working on. Neither of them are good for the environment, whether it's the tyranny of the minority or tyranny of the majority. They're both potentially detrimental and have problems for any kind of collective action that might be a basis for democracy. Back to fisheries again, is that if you think about these tyrannies and you think about who they serve, there is the population model of access and production are related to these things. There may be a group that's interested in decreasing access and promoting assets or wealth. Those could be lots of fish and the ecosystems they provide. And there might be another group that's interested in increasing access with no limitations. And those might be pro people that are hungry and poor and need food, and who don't acknowledge or don't know that there is some maximum sustained yield, but they worry about access, whereas a group of typically the wealthy might be trying to control access. So these population models and the issues around democracy and the issues around access are all intertwined. They're not separate. They're all intertwined, and they're related by some of these population biology models that we'll talk about. When we think about governance, there's a lot of issues at stake here, and there are various issues. Some of it is about making people happy. Some of it is about survival, adaptation. Some of it is about stability of the system itself. And so I'm sort of throwing out some things to think about here, which is the curve on the left is showing you a theory of governance, a book written by Ian Bremen. I see him on TV a lot. He wrote a book that was expressed some of his ideas, and he argued that governance stability has a J shape. That if you have very low levels of openness, that is, you have dictators and tyrannies, there's a certain amount of stability around that. But you increase the openness a little bit, and the stability of the system becomes very unstable. That is, that people start to, our governance bodies tend to undermine each other, create a lack of vision, compete too much with each other, such that there is no stability. So a dictatorship or a single party system might actually be more stable than a party system that has just a few representatives. But the idea that is the more open the system is, the more democracy, the more open dialogue, the more the open society exists, the stability increases again, and it exceeds that of a dictatorship. And so he uses that idea to look around the world and look at the different types of governance systems that occur. And that's kind of the theory. Recently on the right, a group of scientists, Japanese scientists, looked at the level of open society and satisfaction in society for many countries. This is based on the World Value Survey. And they found that open societies foster other benefiting attitudes, that is tolerance, trust, civic engagement, and minimization of material pressure. So if you look at openness, which is often a form of individualism, and the ability of people to express their opinions and to have individual behaviors, people tend to be happier. But it's not just the individualism that makes them happy. In fact, some parts of individualism do not make them happy. For instance, competition, for instance, isolation. These tend to be negatively associated with happiness. But in general, these other eusocial things, other benefiting attitudes, tolerance, trust, civic engagement, they tend to go along with open society. So people tend to be happier. So we could argue, well, openness is a good thing. Tyranny is a bad thing. Dictatorship is a bad thing. However, it may depend on other things. Being happy is not always the main purpose in society. There are other things we have to think about. And I think in many cases, to me, this coronavirus is a classic example of where there may be limits to openness. We're beginning to see open societies having trouble making decisions, having trouble controlling individual behavior, having issues around making decisions and how to, what kind of behaviors people should have. And so in many ways, when I think about this open society, you might ask yourself, well, life satisfaction is important, but what about adaptation and survival? Perhaps these are competing systems of openness versus closed societies, and they're going to have different outcomes under different conditions. So if you look at the coronavirus cases, you'll notice a lot of the open societies are having rapid colonization of the coronavirus. Many of the more closed hierarchical societies like Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, that do use the science and the practicalities of science are actually having slower rates of change. And I saw this graph on the right just, I think, yesterday, and thought, that's interesting. One person argues it may be due to the use of masks. So you might see, oh, well, there's many ways to interpret this. I don't want to tell you what's right or wrong, but in what goes through my head there is, in individual open societies, the idea of wearing masks is not socially acceptable, whereas possibly in collective societies where there's a more authoritarian rule, and more practicality about what's good for the group, putting on masks might be more acceptable. I find the idea of wearing a mask very foreign to me. I would have a hard time doing it. I might do it at some point, but I wouldn't jump out and put one on and walk around with it. And so these kinds of subtleties of human organization, cultural organization, political organization, might have very different outcomes. They may have different satisfaction levels, but satisfaction is different from adaptation and survival. So why do I bring that up? The question I ask myself is, what about conservation? Is conservation action about satisfaction? Or is it some sort of adaptation, some sort of survival thing that we have to think about? And that conversation repeats itself quite a bit. Is it the activities of the elite who are interested in protecting nature for its own sake, or for their own personal desire to see wildlife, elephants, etc.? Or is it actually part of an adaptive strategy that's important? And if so, who's going to adapt? Who's going to adopt these conservation strategies in order to in order to conserve in a way that is either improve satisfaction with life, or perhaps adaptation and survival? So I looked at this in a paper in 2016. If you haven't seen this, it's an interesting paper. And I look at the number of species around the world. I look at the GDP, conservation spending. I look at rule of law. I look at particularly at money spent on conservation. And what you can see if you plot two axes of human organization, which is the Hofstede Individualism Index and the Hofstede Power Distance Index, you'll see that the spending on conservation follows those patterns of human organization fairly strongly. That is that nations that have strong individualism, that is, they have open societies, generally spend more money on conservation. They have stronger rules of law, and that the countries that have high power distance, which is a measure of hierarchy, a measure of inequality, a measure of dictatorship in many cases, they generally spend less money on conservation. So it means that conservation spending has is core influenced by these social organization things. Does that mean the group on the right, the Denmarks, the Austria, France, etc., USA, Australia, the Anglo countries, are going to be more adaptive in the future? Or are they just creating conservation for the purpose of their own satisfaction and personal enjoyment with wildlife? And what about the countries on the left? Guatemala, Ecuador, what is the adaptation there? Is it just a matter of the rule of law and spending? Or is there some important adaptation aspects to it? So I'll argue, at least for coral reefs, that I'm very concerned that countries that do not spend money on conservation or do not have passive conservation are potentially setting themselves up for environmental disasters. And that conservation may be an adaptive way to spend money. So back to the study of recovery. Is to understand conservation, we have to understand how fast fish populations recover and to what levels they recover. And so I spent a lot of time looking at closures, fishing closures throughout the Western Indian Ocean. And what you're seeing here is sort of a plot of the age of the closure and the biomass of fish in these closures. Most of this is done in East Africa, but some of it's in the Seychelles and elsewhere. And you can see it takes about 20 years for these closures to reach their maximum biomass, in this case of around 1,000 kilograms per hectare. And you need quite a bit of time as well. You need at least, you need time and size. So you need at least somewhere between 5 and 10 kilometers of closure, and you need somewhere between probably 15 and 25 years of time to get those kind of biomasses. Those are considerable sizes in time. If you're trying to get people to not fish for 25 years, that's an issue. Or if you need 5 to 10 square kilometers to get no fishing, that's an issue politically. How are you going to achieve that? On the right, you're seeing areas that I looked at that were purportedly closures, but they weren't very good. And you can see some of these patterns break down in these low compliance closures. These are some of the younger closures that people are trying to do now in terms of some of these are octopus type closures or other types of closures. They are much more variable in terms in compared to the national parks. So this helps us to understand a little bit what are the costs of conservation in terms of time and space. They are significant. They don't occur without costs. And what are the rates? And that R of 0.23, tells you a rate of recovery, and that tells you how fast you can expect things to recover. Now, that work was based on East Africa, and East Africa lacks any wilderness. It doesn't have remote areas like the Chagos or the Seychelles or the Line Islands or the Phoenix Islands. These areas that are very far offshore. They are specific to small areas of closure. They are different. What we find out later is that they are active conservation. They are not passive in the sense that people can't get to them. People can get to them, and you have to actively engage in conservation to achieve it. But there is a massive amount of potential passive conservation. That is just simply areas that people can't reach. And because they can't reach it or the costs are too high, fish populations can also be quite high in those areas as well. So what I did with Josh Sinner and myself and quite a big group of people, is we got together and shared all our fish biomass data from all over the world. And this plot you're seeing here is the travel time of the biomass of those fish in these coral reefs as a function of how many hours it takes you to travel to get there. And we have two sort of types of travel. That's travel to the nearest human settlement where people live, and then travel to nearest major markets. These are cities and major markets that might drive demand for fish. And you can see that travel time is an important determinant of biomass. That is, if you're more than 4 or 5 hours away from human settlements, then biomass reaches that high level of over 1,000 kilograms per hectare. In the case of markets, those markets drive obviously exploitation. In fact, you have to be more than 10 hours. In many cases, I use 9 hours in this study that I'll show you later, but you have to be above at least 9 hours before you get fish to recover. These are forms of passive conservation. These are based on large sample sizes. So what we realized when we looked at this paper, and you can read it, the papers, in many cases, by the way, I'm putting the citations down below so that if you find any of this interesting, you can go and find the information, that remote areas and high compliance closures have very different leveling points. And what we're finding out too is they have very different recovery rates because of the life histories of the animals in each of these types of conditions. The important point is that active conservation in the areas around people, one, they never really reach the same levels of biomass as remote areas. And part of that is because many of the big animals that have life histories that require a lot of time and a lot of space for them to survive don't do well in these parks. They're not protected by them. And you can see that in obvious cases with really small parks. You're not going to contain a shark or a big grouper in these small parks. And that's what we see even on this large landscape, seascape view, is that at these small scale, at the countries that have parks, never really reach the biomass levels of areas that have wilderness. So that means you have active conservation and passive conservation, and they have two different outcomes. Active cannot reach the levels of passive conservation. There may be some cases where that's true, but in general, that's not going to be the case. There are just different life histories of animals in those two different environments, and one cannot contain the other. So that's a problem if you're trying to think about, pristine biomass or what is natural or what's undisturbed. They're clearly different. So what I've been doing recently is mapping out these coral reefs that are away from people and asking myself, where are these areas and where aren't they? Because if you don't have wilderness, you don't have the buffer, the safety margin to protect your species of fish. Because you don't have large enough landscapes or seascapes, in order to contain these species. That is sharks, big groupers, sweet lips, big snappers. All of these things may disappear out of these systems because you lack either active conservation and you lack the passive conservation. So if you look at the map of the world here, this is whether or not how many of the coral reefs, randomly selected coral reefs, based on 25,000 observations, are greater than 4 hours from human settlements. And what you can see is that a lot of the world does not have a lot of passive conservation or wilderness. Most of Africa, most of the Caribbean, most of Asia has less than 10% of its reefs more than 4-hour travel distance to people. In fact, it's about 13% of the world that actually has 13% of the reefs of the world that are beyond 4 hours from human travel. So it means that you have actually a fairly small percentage of the world's reefs in passive conservation. And if we look at active conservation, it's about 2.5% of the world's reefs are actively conserved if you randomly select reefs. So you're only having 2.5% of the world's reef in active conservation, which doesn't reach the level of biomass as passive. And you only have 13% of the world's reefs in passive conservation, and it's very unequally distributed. You can see the Pacific Ocean and the Eastern Pacific and a few areas in Asia and Australia. But in general, people get around and they potentially are influencing the biomass in many of these areas. So that's a problem. If you believe that having fish biomass, having wilderness is an important part of the adaptation of a society, then we do not have a very adaptive society in terms of protecting wildlife. If we have disasters in our fisheries, we don't have refugia to recolonize and restart over the system. We have very little. And so this could be a serious adaptation problem. Imagine it was antibodies. If you didn't have the antibodies to a particular disease, you would not be able to survive these things. So in many cases, this diversity, this protection of nature, I think is an important part of adaptation that we're not really looking at very effectively. So if we look, I'm now going to give an example of why I think it's important and how we can quantify this better and maybe deal more effectively in terms of developing policies to avoid these kind of disasters. What you're seeing here is the amount of active conservation, that's high compliance closures in green, versus passive conservation as determined by these two metrics of greater than 4 hours from people and greater than 9 hours from cities. And you can see I've just done this for the Western Indian Ocean. I've done it for the whole globe, but I'll only show you the Western Indian Ocean because I want to give you a case study. If you look at the East African Coral Coast, it has a fair amount of active conservation. In fact, in our region, in that region of the world, it's one of the better areas. Another area is the Chagos, but the Chagos is very remote. So we've put a big part of the Chagos in protected areas, high compliance closures, but it's very far away from people. It's not doing fisheries management. It's just acquiring property on a map for a government to control. It's not a part of it. in an area where there's a great deal of already passive conservation. It's arguable it may not even be that effective. But if we look at East Africa, we can see there's a massive deficit in terms of the percentage of what you might call wilderness. What do I mean by a deficit? Many studies, over 100, around 150 studies have been used to figure out what amount of area should be not fished in order to maintain the attributes you're looking for in protected areas. That is sustainability, protection of species, food security, a variety of things. And you can read, if you're interested, there's a paper by O'Leary in 2016 that describes that. And they argue that's about 30%. That if you close off about 30% of the area, then you have the services you're hoping to get from that fishery. And so what you can see here is even in East Africa, you have barely 5% of that area in active conservation, in some form of conservation, passive or active, and the majority is a deficit. So you're in trouble potentially in all of those regions. Some of the areas like southern India and Sri Lanka, it's all deficit. Those areas, there's high human populations, high dependency on those things. Those areas are potentially setting themselves up for disaster. They haven't either passively or actively engaged in coral reef protection. And so there could be problems with that. So what? Well, if we look at Kenya, this is a plot of fishing effort and the rate of change of the fishery in Kenya. And so if we look at the 0 point, which is the point at which sustainability would be achieved for Kenya, you would see all of those areas are decaying. They are losing catch year by year. So Mgwani, Mwanyaza, Nyali, these are areas that are losing a percentage of catch every year. So when we're in the East African coast, you can see that these processes are ongoing at a slow rate, but at a steady rate. This data is based on about 20 years of measuring catch over time, and we can see the rate of decay. To me, these fits are really strong. They're almost scarily strong to me in the sense that they're so predictable. The final one is so predictable. It has an R-square of 0.94 that it's hard to imagine this being anything other than a very deterministic system of yields, that the ideas are the processes are unfolding in a very mechanical way, if you like. One of the good things about this graph is it tells you also what the sustainable fisheries is, because the intercept of the 0 line is in fact the fishing effort or the yield that will give you sustainable yield. So you can see in the top graph, the sustainable yield for Kenya is somewhere around 3.9 tons per kilometer squared per year, and that's achieved at a fishing effort of around 5 fishermen per square kilometer. Now, if you remember back to my original slide, that number is way below 10 and 16 that was estimated 30 years ago based on other methods. So if you had used that guideline to come up with maximum sustained yields, you would be sorely wrong. However, part of the problem in Kenya is that the biomass of fish is not at the sustainable yield level, and that's what you're looking for in the top right graph, is that the biomass of fish is closer to about 20 tons per kilometer squared due to overfishing. And therefore, that's why you're getting 3.9 tons per kilometer squared. If you could increase the biomass up to more in the 50 to 60 tons per kilometer squared, then you could achieve yields of around 6 tons per kilometer squared per year. And that is, in fact, about close to what the actual yields are, maximum sustained yields, but they're not being achieved in Kenya because the human effort is somewhere between 10 and 15 fishermen per square kilometer, whereas the sustainable yield is achieved at 5 fishermen per square kilometer. So that's why we have overexploitation and we don't have any wilderness. So if we don't manage this fishery well, we're setting ourselves up for losing a major source of animal protein in a country and a continent that is severely protein deficient. Africa is losing 1 million tons of fish per year due to poor fisheries management. And this is just one example of why this is occurring. And this is one of the better studied examples. We're already beginning to see disappearance of species. These are some of the species that have disappeared based on interviews with fishermen and our own transect data, both in the field and fish landing data. You can see you're losing quite a few of the groupers, but also some of the sweet lips and a variety of some things that sharks and other things you might not entirely expect to be disappearing. But based on an objective evaluation, we're losing species. So these also lack wilderness. So these are potentially palatable, consumed species that are starting to disappear out of our fishery. One of the good things now about figuring this stuff out, what is the biomass and what is the recovery rate, is you can start to model this on a very large scale. And that's what you're seeing here, is an attempt to model the biomass in this part of the world that I work in. And you can see that much of Madagascar and southern Madagascar, the Kenyan coast, has very low biomass levels. Some of them are more moderate. Northern Madagascar has better biomass. Mozambique, better, more moderate, but more closer to the maximum sustained yield. And since we now know the recovery rates, we can figure how many years it would take to recover. And that's what the map on the right shows you. How many years might it take for you to get your fish back to this maximum sustained yield level? And there are costs associated with it. And we're talking about poor people in Southwest Madagascar, the Viso people, might need 6 or 8 years of no fishing at all to get their fish back to a maximum sustained yield level. Every place is a little bit different. But you can see from this map that we're losing potential food in this region with very little wilderness. Maxwell and I have been working on this problem on a larger scale, and we have a paper coming out in Fish and Fisheries, so it might interest you. This is one of the key graphs there, showing what the biomass in various ecoregions of the world where there is data and where there is yield data, and what the maximum sustained yields are. And you can see the East African Coral Coast, we project a maximum sustained yield of 6 tons per kilometer squared if you can get the right amount of effort. It's a little bit less than 6, but many of the other regions are either underexploited, which are the remote areas of the Chagos, New Caledonia. That makes sense, Seychelles, and some areas like Samoa are probably highly exploited, such as in western and northern Madagascar. The good thing about this kind of model, and you can read the paper, I won't go into the detail, is that curve tells you what your possibilities are. If your K, your biomass, is 200 tons per kilometer squared, and your R is such and such and such, this is what your maximum sustained yield should be. So once we begin to know what K and R are, we can now come up with much more realistic estimates of maximum sustained yield. And if you read the paper, and I won't go into much detail here, it generally lies in that range of probably around 4 to 8 tons per kilometer squared per year, which means that the estimates that we had in the past were way overestimated. And that's not just a problem with the models, that's a problem with human behavior, that we tend to discount nature and its ability to feed us. And there's a drive to drive the resource lower and lower because you don't know what this MSY is, and because the politics drives you into an area where there are very few restrictions, you have no restrictions on access, and people begin to overexploit the system. That is the human condition, and one that we're not very good at rectifying. So that's what I want to talk about now in my last half of my talk, is that how do we deal with this problem? We have these restrictions, we know what they are, but how do we get them to work? And one thing you have to remember about the fisheries system, this is sort of the holistic fisheries management model, is there's a lot of components to it. And a lot of them are fascinating. The environment is fascinating. The ecosystem itself is fascinating. When I was your age, that was my main interest in how ecosystems organize. And social organization itself is fascinating. All of these things, in principle, feed into a sustainable policy, management policy. But ultimately, it boils, the management policy and then the associated management boils down to a few basic things that we can do. We can limit or restrict gear, time, space, species, size, and effort. So you can study the system as much as you like, and all of that study is a wonderful thing to do. But if you really want to manage the system, you have to get engaged in these management limits. That's the gear, space, time, species, effort. There's not that much focus on it. If you're in my field of coral reefs, there's a lot of people studying ecosystem processes, abundance, structure, biodiversity. There are very few people studying these restrictions or the social organization that would be related to those restrictions, because human organization and restrictions are going to go hand in hand. Just the way wearing masks and not wearing masks may depend on whether people see this as a culturally acceptable behavior. Whether you have gear restrictions or species restrictions, many of these have cultural components. Some of them are very difficult to change because the cultural inertia in them is very strong. And that includes academics as well. And I'll give some examples of that. So first of all, just to, and I assume people are familiar with common property protocols. I kind of a shout out to Eleanor Ostrom, who kind of developed some of the ideas around common property that are critical today. The idea that common property is not all the same thing. There are excludable and non-excludable forms of private property. There are rivalrous and non-rivalrous. People compete or don't compete for common property. So when we think of common property as various types of things, they fall into different categories. And some of them we're better at managing than others. So things that are excludable, like private goods and public goods, like clubs, these are something that the rule of law tends to be fairly good at managing. The rule of law is developed in order that privatization is understood, and there are consequences for stealing or doing uncivic behavior in parks. You know, that's what we're having now, right? We're closing the parks in California. Why? Because people show up with the coronavirus. But we have ways of dealing with those things in the law. And some of the more difficult things to manage are what we're concerned with here, which is fish stocks. They're non-excludable and they're rivalrous. That's when you take a fish out of the sea, it's for you and not for everybody else. And it's difficult to control you because the sea is not an easily managed place. It's open in principle to everybody. The cost of managing it is not cheap. It's not easily done. The rule of law is vague about it. There are a bunch of issues around it. And as a result, Ostrom developed some principles at least so we can find out what maybe leads to better forms of management under those particular systems. So she develops the systems of governance, the group identity, costs and benefits, consensus building, monitoring, graduated sanctions, conflict resolution, some autonomy, polycentric governments. These are elements, you know, the Ostrom principles that might allow you to help you to deal with these problems. So these things are governance problems. The previous slide was the technical problem of just what do you do in terms of space, time, species, but you have to have these governance systems coupled with the actual restrictions themselves. And then of course there's this big problem, which is that decisions are not often made in a rational way that what I mean by that is good for everybody, but is often based on the tyranny of the majority, the tyranny of the minority, and what people's desires are, what people want, whether they think things are fair or not, and difficult trade-offs. So it's the classic problem. A trolley running down the railway track, do you let it kill 4 people you don't know, or you let it kill one of your family members? See, these basic human issues repeat themselves in these common property issues, where the desire that you hope, the desired outcome, they are not independent of the person making the decisions. Their decisions are based on what it is that they want in life. So this is complicates things considerably. And it becomes more complicated when you consider that everybody has a different opinion on some of these things. And many of the times we don't even share the basic same definitions about things and the same value system. So here's sort of a funny joke. What's your opinion about food shortages? Well, what is food is what the African asks. And the European is, what does shortage mean? And the American says, what does the rest of the world mean? And the Arab says, what does opinion mean? These are fundamental problems that you have when you're communicating with people about perspectives on common property resources. Sometimes these basic fundamentals are interpreted very differently among different people based on societies. And then there's this other problem that most people don't consider at all, but I know is very important, which is the idea that there are different kinds of forums. Even when you get groups of people together, who shows up at these forums can be very selective. They're what are called enclave forums. Enclave forums is what we're having now. We are a group of educated people with a common interest in policy of marine resources, and we are an enclave. And when we get together, we look at things slightly different than other groups of people. And there, in most systems that I look at, there's a public forum, and there are the participants that participate in it. Those could be intellectuals, the university people. They could be residents and traders. They might have a gender aspect to them. They might be more associated with profits. Others might be more associated with survival. And in most of those forums, there's either a public forum and then there's a shadow forum. There's a people that don't show up, and yet they're important. In their case of fisheries, if they're migrant fishermen or friar women, chances that they show up at a public forum are not good. And yet they can often drive a lot of the variables in the human system as to how they capture fish and the marketing of that fish. And if they're not involved, you can't solve problems without them. So this shadow forum is something you have to think about in any kind of problem solving around common pool resources. This is sort of a model that I thought a group of social scientists working on common property kind of came up with. It looks a little bit complicated, but it made a lot of sense to me because it has two really main attributes to me that I encounter a lot in the work that I do. And one is what on the left I personally call the circle of shirking. I don't know if you're not, I hope everybody, I don't know how good everyone's English is, but shirking is the idea of avoiding one another. And in many cases, this cycle of shirking is a very real thing. People don't participate in forums for various reasons. Or if they do, they have conflicts or they avoid conflicts. Conflict avoidance is a major part of human behavior. And so you can't solve problems if you enter into this cycle of shirking, and you end up in often lose-lose situations. And then there's the other circle, which is searching for win-win or acceptable trade-offs. That's the circle on the right, where depending on how able you are to communicate with each other, how well you can identify alternatives, whether you have any scientific evidence to know what the outcomes of different solutions would be, this then allows you to enter into a trade-off or a win-win situation. Anytime you encounter forums, you're going to enter into the possibility that you could be stuck in an endless shirking cycle, or you could possibly end into a more of a win-win situation or acceptable trade-off situation. So you need to think about this when you're developing policy. The cycle of shirking on the left, we spend a lot of time in conservation going around that circle. And that's often why we create enclave forums, is because in the enclave we agree with one another, and it's very uncomfortable to deal with a shadow forum. You have to get outside of yourself, outside of your culture, outside of your value system to have a communication that allows you to solve problems and to find those solutions. So there's a lot of cultural issues here that go on that most people don't fully appreciate. And this is sort of the classic adaptive cycle that we think of. If you're in school and you're in an intellectual enclave, we worship this particular system of adaptive cycle, which is the solving problems and saving the information to use in the future. And I like this quote in many cases by David Deutsch. The beginning of Affinity has a very, what would I call it, infinite view of science, that we can solve all problems if we develop the cycle. And that our moral imperative is not to destroy the mechanism for correcting mistakes. That's a deep statement. It means that what we really need to do is make sure we have legacies. And science is that legacy for most of us. But it's under attack, or it's being undermined by cultural systems that don't value this adaptive cycle, because it may not be in the interests of particular groups, either the minority or the majority, depending on what sort of tyranny there is. So while this is a good approach, and it's something we should always move towards, we have to remember that these don't always just naturally occur on them to themselves. Think of the coronavirus, and whether or not the science was well enough developed, for example, and whether we save that information. And what about the next virus that comes through? What will we learn from it? Well, certain countries did learn from it. Hong Kong learned from it. Singapore learned from it, and they adapted, and they are doing what seems to be working. So those are cases where it does happen. But in other cultural systems, the legacy is not maintained. So these adaptive governance principles, I won't go into them. Maybe these are things you study there, but they are there to create ways to deal with these issues in a productive way that in principle create adaptation. But another thing to remember is that a lot of this applies to what we call conventional problems. These are problems that when you isolate them and you break them down in their component parts and you figure them out, you can come to good solutions. A conventional problem would have been the maximum sustained yield problem I just showed you. There you can see that if we use scientific principles, the math of R and K and decay rates and logistic curves, I can come up with a calculation for your maximum sustained yield. I can come up with a conventional solution. However, many problems are wicked. That means that they're not containable. They are not easily broken down into component parts. Poor people might understand my maximum sustained yield, but they're driven by day-to-day desires to survive. And so they can't really adapt in a way, the same way that people that had time and space to be able to do different things. So just remember that many problems, particularly in the developing world, are wicked problems. They don't have any solutions that are obviously clear. They're connected to other kinds of problems. They're problems within problems, nested problems. And so you need another approach to dealing with those types of problems. And time won't allow me to go into that in any detail, but it's something to think about. Now I want to talk about academics, because we have our own set of problems, which we don't often recognize very well. And that is that we're often out of touch with what the rest of the world's problems are, because we have a different set of incentives. In our world, we submit to the peer review system, a review system of experts. And that creates its own set of behaviors and ideas. In many cases, it also means we share some common values. So on the right is a questionnaire I asked all the members of the International Society for Reef Studies to ask what their major interests were. And you can see the top interest is marine protected areas. And then Cnidaria, which is corals, biodiversity assessment, ecological assemblages, hexacorals, which is another way of corals and fish, climate change. These are the things that academics in my field are interested in. None of them are really put poverty down. None of them put organization. None of them put, politics in there. So they have their own set of things they find interesting, and they have their own set of incentives. They have to submit to that system that we have in the academic environment, and they get their recognition from it. So does that affect what we do? I would argue it does. This is an example of that, where I looked at what people studied and what they got cited for in the coral reef literature. And what you can see is that of the restrictions that I mentioned in the beginning, most of the studies are on spatial closures and reserves, both in terms of the articles and the citations and the H-index and the number of authors. If you get down to size restrictions, there's almost nobody working on those things. If you look at species restrictions, gear, which is something I look at, it's much less focused. So this change in focus will have considerable implications to both what we do. We're all in search of our citations and our H-index and having colleagues that share common views. So we're not likely to engage in restrictions that are not particularly interesting in terms of our own incentives and in terms of the groups of people that we work with. And that has consequences for solving problems. If we're not solving problems that are have different social organization solutions to them, we may be outside the system or making recommendations that are simply inappropriate. And one way to look at this is to look at your restrictions more in terms of the trade-offs, because these are the real things that people experience. When you say, oh, a fisheries closure is a great solution, well, you haven't really considered all the trade-offs that people that are being affected by that restriction are considering when they think about these restrictions. Again, I don't have a lot of time, but basically we think that there's sort of a gradient of trade-offs where minimum size of fish is a very low trade-off. You don't have to give up a lot to have a minimum size of fish. But as you move along the top of that table, by the time you get to reduced numbers of fishermen, that creates a system of winners and losers. There are definitely people that will suffer from those kind of decisions. Closures have a very similar sort of hard trade-off type thing. So hard trade-offs are very difficult to deal with. They're the trade-off that we're talking about with the coronavirus now, which is how many deaths versus the economy, money versus human life. These are trade-offs that nobody really likes to discuss. They're what we call taboo trade-offs. They're trade-offs that are very uncomfortable. And fisheries can have a similar set of taboo trade-offs, that is, things we rather not think about in terms of who are going to be the winners and losers, in terms of restricting fisheries or when we make closures or other types of decisions. And these trade-offs can be viewed by people differently in different social strata, because some trade-offs don't affect you. Take the coronavirus. If you're young, you don't feel the trade-off. If you're over 80, you feel it. You don't, one says, I'd love the economy to grow, and the other is like, I'm not so sure. I'd rather prefer to live. These are similar kinds of social strata. We'll look at these things very differently from one another, and that's where a lot of the conflicts arise. How do we deal with that problem? Well, this is an example from Kenya where we asked all these landing sites to kind of rate their preference for these types of restrictions. And you can see there are some, even in one country like Kenya, there's a considerable amount of variability. There are certain people, like in Shimoni and Bapingo, that generally positive about a lot of restrictions. But if you go to Shangarubu or Shanga, they really don't like closed areas, closed seasons, and protected areas, but they don't mind minimum size of fish, and they don't mind gear restrictions. So even within a single country, you can have quite a bit of variability in the kind of preference they have for restrictions. And part of this relates, hello?
Yeah, Tim, it's Anne. I just wanted to note to you that we have about 10 minutes left. Mm-hmm. And I know this group well enough to know that they'll be dying to ask you questions. So
well, if you want, I can
this
stop.
Is really great, but if you could wrap it up a little so they have a chance to ask you. Some people might be able to stay on later, but I'm not sure if they can. I hate to interrupt because it's so fascinating, but I want to also give people a chance to engage with you.
Yeah, by the way, you always have to stop me because I'll just go all afternoon, by the way. You know. So let me just make a few more points and then I'll stop, okay?
Sure.
Let me just finish with this point and then I'll stop, which is, these are the types of restrictions we're looking at, and this is the difference between resource users and managers. So imagine the managers here have college degrees. They're involved they're involved in national governments, typically fisheries departments, NGOs, or whatnot. And this is the difference between their preference for a restriction and a fisherman's restriction. And what you can see is that the difference generally increases depending on the country you're in with the trade-off system that we talked about. So managers don't experience trade-offs the same way that resource users do. And it depends on the country. So Madagascar and Mozambique having fairly different views than Kenya and Tanzania. Some of that is naivete as well. Mozambique and Madagascar does not have a lot of these restrictions, so they may not look at them as having consequences, whereas Kenya and Tanzania do, and they are more aware of those restrictions. So whether you're a manager or a user, you view these systems of restriction very differently, and that's where a lot of the core conflicts occur. Overall, one of the major things that we found out when we look at all of these types of restrictions is one of the major drivers of preference for restrictions is what we call fairness. And fairness is just the sense that you and your community are getting as many or as much benefit as the national government. And the more fair that system is, the more people tend to believe that these systems are good. And so what I would argue then is that how you look at these restrictions depends much on the scale at which you tend to exist as a human being, in terms of whether you connect at the national system or an international system or at a very local system. And so your support may greatly depend on where these perceptions of benefits are and where you exist in the social scale. So I think I will stop there. I could go on, as I say, but I won't. And open it up for questions.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much. Really fascinating talk. Definitely engaging with some, as you said, very wicked, complex challenges that we face. I guess we can try and just let people speak up, but if I start getting too many voices trying to speak at once, then maybe I'll ask people to either raise their hand or use the chat box to ask a question. But let's give it a try right now and see if someone wants to speak up. Just remember to unmute your voice so you can ask a question. Anybody want to jump in? Come on, don't be shy. I know you're not a shy group.
I won't bite.
Come on, folks.
Hello.
Hi there. Who's speaking?
Hi, yeah. Hi, Tim. This is Galu.
Hello, Galu.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. It was amazing and so many data, so many great things that you shared. I kind of share your thoughts about being apolitical, and that ended up being pretty much political in my work the past 13 years. But anyways, apologies if you already discussed about this and I maybe missed it, but could you share your experience in communicating all these precious information to the government, maybe in Kenya where you work? Maybe that first. I have a couple of questions, but maybe that first.
Okay, well, so, that's a struggle, is to know how to communicate and who do you communicate and what medium do you use. These are all very complicated questions. The standard model for us as educated scientists is to write our publications, present to the government, and turn it over to the government to engage in the policy or the behavioral change that you hope would happen. I came to a conclusion quite a long time ago that that system doesn't really work very well, at least not in the countries that I worked in. So I kind of developed a two-tiered system, which I think has worked fairly well, which I sort of, you'll see it in this presentation, which is that to me, there's the peer review system, which is sort of a conventional problem-solving approach, which is, you break down a problem into its component parts, and you evaluate it, and you come to a set of recommendations. And that is rigorously evaluated by your nasty peers who don't agree with you and are used to open society and open dialogue and have mechanisms for conflict resolution within their own system. But that doesn't work so well within national governments, particularly ones that are hierarchical, that are not that used to open society, not used to open discussion. These can be very uncomfortable, nor do they work particularly well with people that lack formal education. So that's when I started the Fishers Forum, was the idea that I would communicate to to two groups, mostly. One would be a forum of resource users, and one would be a group of academics that would have a different point of view. So I've lived in these two parallel communication societies for a long time. And they each have their own different elements of organization. But in the Fishers Forum, it was a chance to get people to at least have voice, to at least have voice, because a lot of the problems that I saw was just people not sitting down in a room and talking through these problems. That was problem one. Problem two is they lacked information, and so they were often making decisions based on their subjective positions and desires. But in the case where information was available, they would adjust their decisions. That was the later part of my talk, which I haven't got to, but that was, once people have information, they will tend to adjust their decisions more towards what might be more benefit to the collective as opposed to individual desires. So these two parallel systems are kind of the way I've worked. And one of the things I'm fairly proud of is that most of the stuff you see in peer review that has anything to do with fisheries has actually gone through the public forum. So those people who are engaged in the public forum have commented on whether they disagree or agree or pointed out issues. But getting to that point in that group took a number of years because people were very conflict oriented. There was a lot of just fighting, close to violent behavior early on in those forums because people had not had a voice before, and when they did have a voice, they were angry, and they wanted to blame people, and they wanted to consequences. And they were not used to objectively evaluating information. They were used to expressing their subjective positions on things, and that was conflict generating. So a lot of my role was to calm down this anger and annoyance about issues, the blame, etc., and use objective science and data collection as a way to do that. So the data you're seeing in those graphs of fish decay rates, for example, that was done by that community. I was doing the analysis, but the actual collection of the data was in many ways supervised by those communities. So they were participant in that process. So there was the participation, the voice, the dialogue part that had to go on, which was unusual for them because they were used to a top-down system.
Great.
And
Let's see.
then there's the open society, which is what science is, which is more used to those mechanisms for dealing with that in a slightly different way, a more restricted enclave form sort of way. But those are the two worlds I live in, yeah.
Okay, I bet there's some more questions out there. I could tell that Tom was gearing up to ask a question. Go for it, Tom.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. And hello to everyone else. I haven't seen you in a long time. It's great to finally be in a classroom. Yeah, it's good to be in a classroom with everyone. I'm going to ask a question. It's quite late here. I'm calling from the UK, so it might not be as well formed as I would have liked. But the question that I thought of as you were going through the latter part of your talk is why is it that there is such a focus on spatial and spatiotemporal ways of conserving fish populations, and a comparatively little focus being paid to size restrictions and gear restrictions? I mean, size restrictions in particular, I personally in my work haven't encountered anywhere near as much as I have people trying to establish spatial MPAs. I came to the CSP program from an organization called Blue Ventures, which I'm sure you're familiar with from your Western Indian Ocean work. And, you know, they're very much focused on spatial and spatiotemporal conservation measures. So, yeah, my question is, why are people more engaged in that element than size or gear limitations?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue it's a cultural bias, because the idea of private property is a core part of Western civilization and the rule of law associated with private property. And so when we engage elsewhere, one of the first things we do in the colonial system and elsewhere, and even the modern colonial system, is that we fall back on what we're familiar with, which is the idea of property, area, ownership. So, and it's interesting because it's, unfortunately, it sometimes gets so disengaged from function that it's possibly not very useful. The Chagos is a classic example in my case. And it's like there's an interest in establishing property rights in an area where it has strategic value. So you're creating marine protected areas in an area where it doesn't provide any fisheries management tool. So one of the really interesting things is one of the evaluations, I didn't have time to show it to you, is that most of the active closures are actually greater than 4 hours away from people. That was kind of shocking to me, because you're supposed to be using these as a tool for fisheries management. So why are you putting them away from people? The reason to me is that you're establishing property rights. And that is sort of the default position of Western style governance systems. And that's because we're used to that and we think about things that way. We continue to do that as we expand our policies elsewhere. So where I am, just to give a counter to that, is gear is a traditional management system, because gear and tradition, that is physical culture, i.e. what you fish with, has a cultural element to it. And so that people identify gear and culture, family, etc., as part of their family and ethnic culture. So there again, they would property rights in Africa is not, historically, is not a big deal. They have ways of dealing with it where nobody owns property for more than, you know, the length of their life at the most. And then decisions are made about that property later. The idea of permanent property and property being owned by a government are very foreign concepts. Of course, they're being embraced now because of, you know, the post-colonial environment that we exist in. But these are cultural things that we don't realize to what extent they actually bias the way we approach problems. And they're very hard to fight. I showed the academic example, right? You would think academics would have the ability to disengage a little bit, but there they are, getting incentives to engage in property right type behavior. And the odd thing about all of this to me is that all of this science that's going around MPAs and closures and function, which is all about functioning yields, when it gets applied in the real world, it gets applied to areas outside of the human influence. See what I'm saying? That's a very odd outcome.
Yeah, totally.
And that's in fact,
yeah, it's such a fascinating
you have
overlap between the political, economic, ecological systems that you kind of refer to in your earlier slides as well.
So you have a lot of smart people solving problems that are not applied very well at the governments get engaged in the actual thing. They use that science to do what they do, which is territorial expansion, ownership of property, global security. You see what I'm saying? They take all this. So these scientists doing all this work, brilliant work, are often being sidelined.
We have another question from Abel that he put in the chat box. Abel, you want to ask the question yourself? You still there, Abel?
I can't see the chat box personally, but maybe I can somewhere here.
Okay, I can ask it for Abel. I don't know if he's still there. He's basically saying, hi, Tim, thanks for the presentation. Abel is from Malawi.
Okay.
And his question is, what other roles can universities take beyond examining the problem, particularly in developing nations with limited resources?
Yeah.
I'm here.
Okay, sorry, Abel.
Sorry.
Did you want to add anything to your question, or was that the gist of it?
That's just about it.
Yeah.
You know what? One of the things, I mean, what the warning I would give academics is a little bit what I just said, is that let's make sure we're not engaging in a strong cultural bias. That's one thing. Two, that we're not entirely engaging in incentives for publicity.
Somebody should mute. Somebody's making a lot of noise moving around. Okay.
Yeah. You know, so academics need to be concerned that their sort of their enclave is has its own inertia, and it's not engaged in society as effectively as it could be within their own countries. I gave examples of where, you know, territory as opposed to function is where political decisions are being made. So what is the advice? The advice I often have is spend time figuring out the people. Before you engage in a problem, spend some time figuring out what actually people are concerned about and what they feel they can actually manage. So what's feasible? The feasibility of something is something that's not often considered by the classic natural scientists. Economists might think about it more, but the feasibility of doing something, it requires that it aligns better with the way human values, these cultural issues that sometimes are not thought through very well. So my approach has been a lot to talk and listen early, you know, and try and understand other people's positions and then engage in problem solving. So a lot of, when I showed you those preferences slides of those different communities, that was me asking people, okay, I don't have any opinions here. You tell me what you want. And what you found is, in that case, there were three clusters of people. There are people that were generally supportive of a lot of restrictions, and that's partly because their governance was strong. And there are people that were really unsupportive of much restriction at all, and that's because their government was weak or corrupt. And then there were people that were sort of modulated between different things because in many cases their government was sort of a mixed bag. But knowing that allowed me to then say, okay, well, let me work with this community here that has this interest because I'm the kind of budget and interest and time I have. I can work with you to solve a few of these problems that are feasible based on the kind of budgets that we have and what you potentially have the interest in complying with. If people have no interest in complying with what you're doing, then why are you spending your time doing these things? So the idea of compliance and the values behind compliance often drives a lot of what I engage in academically, which makes me sort of unusual. And I do that in principle at forfeiting accolades within my own community, which is the academic community, which promotes incentives to participate in what they're participating in and citing one another and participation in that cycle of citation.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Tim.
It's almost 5:40. I'm guessing maybe one more short question, and then I was actually going to ask you, Tim, if anybody would like to engage with you more, knowing that you're right now in the California time zone. Can they send you an email message to schedule like a separate Zoom chat with you?
Yeah, the original idea was that I would come down, I would give this talk, spend the night, and then the following morning, which is tomorrow morning, you could sign up and engage with me, or Nyawita's here as well, by the way, my colleague Nyawita. Yeah, my colleague. Okay, so I think Ando signed up and Maxwell signed up, but I've already talked to Maxwell, so I think we're okay as far as I know. Ando, do you still want to talk tomorrow morning?
I think we canceled those couple actually.
Okay, okay.
Because like with
Yeah.
Maxwell, we chatted this morning, and Andu, I think you adjusted yours. So.
Yeah, we also had to move the time of my course, so it's actually tomorrow morning from 9 to 10:30. That was to adjust for people who are in other countries now.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, I mean, if you want to Zoom with me, you know, sometime maybe tomorrow, either email me or Skype. You can Skype me or Zoom me.
Sure.
My Skype is TR McClanahan, TR with a middle name R Rice. So
Okay.
do that. And yeah, I had set up tomorrow morning to do that, but yeah, any time is fine. But you know, I do have a job too, but I had set up that day, that morning to do those kind of things. Yeah.
Okay. So let's see if we have a final question right now. I'm holding back since I have a chance to talk to you later. I think you and I have a meeting scheduled tomorrow, Tim. Mark, did you want to ask anything, or any other students want to ask something?
I'm like you, and I'm holding off to make sure that students can ask a question, but I do have a burning question.
So does a student have a question? Anybody have a question? If not, we'll let Mark ask his burning question.
Go for it, Mark.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Hey, Tim, if you would scroll down to one of your very last slides, that I think was the preference slides of the various approaches. It was, it's down further. Oh, right there, right there. Thanks.
Yeah.
So this question is really following on Tom's question about not necessarily the bias toward spatial approaches, but not a greater focus on, say, minimum size, especially. Mm-hmm. So what struck me, this is fascinating, because what strikes me about this is across the board how minimum fish size ranks so high, at least always positively, across these various communities. And so right off the bat, it seems like the low-hanging fruit is to say, look, let's just start catching bigger fish. And I would have had that knee-jerk reaction, but Maxwell made the point earlier at some time that that in Kenya, the men take the larger fish and make them available commercially. The women then take the smaller fish and make them more locally available.
That's right.
And so my question is, are there inequities? Are there biases across the different participants in employing a minimum fish size approach?
There definitely is. And again, I didn't have time to go into it. There's a whole paper I wrote on that, on gender, which you might find interesting. In 2017, in that ESA journal, so what's it called? Sustainability paper. Anyway, yes. There's a part of why I was talking about shadow enclaves is because women and migrants and sometimes young men tend to occupy the niche of catching the smaller size fish. And men tend to be more profit oriented, and so they engage in the more profit oriented fishery, which tends to be the larger fish. So you do have that gender problem. And one of the problems is that if you exclude a minimum smaller fish, you're potentially excluding females and migrants and other marginalized people. And that's why if you don't include them in the process, that's why the enclave was the issue there. They will continue to do what they do. What do you do about it? Well, one unsatisfactory approach is to just leave the women and poor alone and say, okay, well, since we're pro-poor, pro-female here, or we don't want to restrict you, we're not going to engage with you. And then you haven't solved the problem. So the other solution is to engage them and try and get them into a more profit-oriented thing, but then they engage in competition with men and more profit-oriented people. So how are you going to do that? Well, this is a tricky social problem. It's not an easily solved problem whatsoever. and it has a very strong emotional component to it. So it's one of these taboo trade-off situations. People rather not even talk about it. And that's what shadow forums create, because you don't really want to engage in what could be seen as anti-female or anti-poor or anti-immigrant type conversations, because you're now talking about restricting access to people that it's uncomfortable to talk about those things. Anyway, so what's the solution? My solution has been to engage the women and the poor. So when I started out this forum, there were no women in it. Now you can find 20% of the forum is women. Women are now occupying political positions within each of these groups. They're typically the secretaries of these BMU associations. So a lot of times when we engage with them, we talk about how to increase profits, how they might engage in more profiteering behavior. The real problem with these the female traders, by the way, is they don't actually make any money. That's the sad thing about it. They are actually, the only reason they survive is because they live in households where somebody else is making a profit. They are busy, they're working long hours, but they are not making any money in most cases. So it's a terrible situation where people are not making any money and they're part of the problem of sustainability. So you have a serious issue there. So again,
women rebel.
Hey? Yeah, well,
women need to rebel. I mean, what you're getting at is that we need, I mean, to really solve that problem, there need to be deeper cultural, political change, which of course, in many different countries, women have, even though these are long cultural traditions, have spoken out and say, wanted to change it. But I realize it doesn't happen overnight.
So one of the fundamental problems, and this won't surprise you, is that these women have zero education, formal education. They live in households that females have traditional roles, and they cannot survive independent of males because of this lack of profit. So they're busy, but they're not profiting. So these are cultural elements that are related to, hemodynamics that are kind of outside of the fishery that I'm involved in. But, so the classic solutions are education, female empowerment, engagement in more profit-based things, acknowledging that these things are problems and need to be solved as opposed to just brushing them away, which is typically what happens. Yeah, what else can I say? It's a problem, you're right. However, yeah, then the other thing is gear management. Gear restrictions, you can see also in that graph, is pretty well. There's a problem there, and again, I was going to talk about that too, but a lot of the gear that people don't like is often used by migrants, and it's often the women who are also the traders in that case. So again, you have these same sort of dynamics. So you can see these situations playing themselves out globally, right? Everything I've said, you can see it in all kinds of societies around the world. So these are not unique to Africa or Kenya. These are global problems. Do I have a solution? Well, I have some of the standard solutions. My personal solution is to engage with migrants and poor and help the education system acknowledge the problem. Many of them don't realize there is a problem. Many of them don't even know they don't make money. That's one of the most fascinating things, is their level of awareness of money and profits is so low that they often don't even realize they're not making money. And when you make it clear to them, they begin to think about things in a different way, like, yeah, why is it I'm doing this thing and I'm not actually making any money? So just this awareness thing is part of what I try and drive as much as possible. And I think if there are solutions to these things, they're quite slow.
I see Andu smiling. Andu, you have a lot of work to do, starting with your capstone and your dissertation. 20 years from now, you'll be giving a talk to the next CSP cohort and telling us about how you move the ball forward from what Tim was just talking about.
Yeah. I mean, these are difficult problems. I have ruminated on them quite a bit. and I try and do the incremental change that I can do, which is in knowledge, engagement, awareness, capacity building, and hope some of that leads to more change. They're fairly entrenched though. So you can get you can be a bit pessimistic about the ability to change. But having said that, if I had gone further into this conversation, you would have realized there's positive things to say about these fisheries. I was getting to the top of the arch of negativity, and then the backside of my talk would have been about positive outcomes. But if you invite me back, I'll present that half of the talk.
We'll invite you back. Okay, with that, I think we should maybe wrap it up. I see we've lost some people, but this has been fascinating, and thank you for your passion about all of this too, and for taking the time to share it with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. I think it's a lot of core elements of human organization and relationships with the environment that repeat themselves, and anywhere you dig into these issues,
right,
deep enough, you'll find some of these elements that we have to think about more deeply as intellectuals and people that are interested in social change and environmental justice. And that means a certain amount of engagement in politics. So I think that would have been my concluding remark. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, we'll look for a time to invite you back. And thank you again. And I will be talking to you, I think, tomorrow. And again, if other people do want to talk soon with Tim, it sounds like tomorrow would be a better day for him.
I sort of left it open, yeah.
Yeah, you can send him an email message, or if you want my help getting his attention, whatever works best. Thanks, everybody. Great to see your faces.
Thank you very much, Tim. Bye-bye.
Stay safe. Let's also give Tim a big hand, a clap. I know there's a way you can do it also on here with reactions here. We can do thumbs up. Do you guys see I don't know if can you guys see those reactions?
Anyway, I don't know.
I don't know that I have it set up properly.
Oh, okay. I see it on my screen, but I can't tell if the rest of you see it. I see Andrew doing it.
Everyone has
practicing these extra Zoom features. Okay, folks. Big hugs to everybody. Thanks again, Tim.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Tim, can you share your slides with the group?
Yeah, if you can email them to me, I'll get them on our shared folder. And anyone who's not a CFP student, let me know if there's anything in there that you don't want shared.
No, they're fine. Most of what I presented is published.
Okay. Yeah. But yeah, if you are not a CSP person and wanting access, you can email me at csp@ucsc.edu and request that.
Yeah, and you can go to my ResearchGate